You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Hi, Paul.
Hey, Brie. How are you doing?
Doing good. On today's episode, it was 3 white bald guys and a Brie.
It sounds like that's one of the fables from the Grimm brothers that does not get talked about often. So I'm glad you're raising it here. That the moral of that story is just
It's
next
deep.
level.
No, but we were so thrilled to welcome Brian McLaren onto our conversation today as we explored the Our story of the cosmic egg. For those of you who don't know who Brian McLaren is, first of all, shame on you. You should. But he is an author, a speaker. He was part of the emergent church movement. He's written a lot about postmodernity and is well known for his series on A New Kind of Christian. If you grew up evangelical like I did, Brian was the equivalent of a Richard Rohr for many of us, a voice in the wilderness who pointed the way to something bigger than the frames we were given.
Yeah, I had that same experience where I remember my friends and I passing around A New Kind of Christian.
Yes.
and having conversations, but it felt a little illicit for the culture that we are in. And he's been such a spotlight to kind of chart a new path forward. And I think, his latest work, Faith After Doubt, is just another kind of great addition to the canon for those of us who are exploring the wider terrains of the kingdom of God as we seek to experience it.
And the CAC is certainly lucky to call him a faculty member now as well. So you'll be hearing more from him. If you haven't heard his podcast series with the CAC, you definitely need to check it out.
Yeah, so good. So good. And what a treat to be in conversation today with Richard and Brian and you. The terrain we cover is so personal and yet universal in the ways that we embody and are formed in groups and organizations that we, in this conversation, call Our Story. How did it hit you to kind of relive some of the Our Story that you were raised with and some of the challenges and leaving as a story to go to a bigger place?
Yeah, it was so helpful. And hopefully you all will find it helpful as well to talk about the experience that you have when all of the sudden you can feel yourself no longer belonging to the Our story that you're a part of. You know, we talked about whether you're sitting in the pew or the gray chair of the megachurch or whatever it is that you're part of, and all of a sudden you have that growing sense of, oh, these shoes don't fit anymore. I don't know that I can be here with integrity anymore. I think I'm being called to a larger frame. And the courage that it takes to then, sort of wander out into the wilderness of the unknown and the not yet.
Yeah, that courage is, it lies in wait with all of us, I think. And sometimes it comes from a teacher like Richard or Brian or Barbara Holmes, who kind of show us something that helps us see beyond the horizon of our own experience. And sometimes it's just this own inkling of, if God is not bigger than this, then this must be a very small God. And that God will often kind of come to perish or has to transform into something much bigger for us to actually live in a believable reality.
Yeah. And, we spent some time talking about not just spiritual or religious our stories, but also politically as well. The tendency to create us versus them, cancel culture, the role of contempt in the formation of that type of groupthink, and how contempt can become really damaging hatred. And, whenever we turn our story into the story, that's so problematic. And both Brian and Richard did an incredible job of pulling that out. So with that, we hope that you'll enjoy this deep, deep dive with Brian McLaren and Richard Rohr and Paul and I into the Our Story portion of what we're exploring on this season of Another Name for Everything. So I'm going to, why don't I open us in prayer? Loving one, weaver of meaning, we ask that you pull out of us what is helpful, that you help us to make connections so that others can feel connected and connect more connection to you and to each other, to this world. Thank you for the opportunity to spend time talking about the meaning, the stories that we create. And we just ask for your guidance and wisdom in all the holy names of God. Amen. So we're going to kick off this conversation about our story, and we're so thrilled to have Brian McLaren with us, faculty member at the CAC. And I have to say, I've been a super fan of yours, Brian, for a long time because I grew up evangelical, and you were the voice in the desert for so many of us evangelicals who were exiting, one particular story, one particular version of the Our Story of Christianity, and we're longing for something new. So I just want to begin by saying, welcome to Another Name for Everything.
Well, thanks. I'm such an avid fan and listener of the podcast. I'm happy to be on it and happy to be with you three amazing people.
So to begin, we want to start this conversation of our story by naming what's healthy about the creation of our story, because there is a healthy and necessary aspect to this part of the cosmic egg. It seems like, especially developmentally, for kids growing up, for all of us, we need the boundaries of an our story in terms of laying the foundation of relationality for us, or for children, to understand ourselves in the context of something beyond the my story, to understand ourselves in the context of relationships and community. So I want to kick us off with this question. What groups do you each belong to that have really aided in your security and identity? Or maybe what groups have you belonged to that have aided your security and identity?
Please start, Brian. They've heard too much of me. Go right ahead.
Well, Richard and I have come from very different backgrounds, but we both came from very strong backgrounds that gave us a very, very deep sense of identity. And each in our own way, I think we've had to rethink a lot of the stories that we inherited. But I grew up in this very esoteric little fundamentalist group. Some people would call it a sect, called the Plymouth Brethren. It's the same group that Garrison Keillor comes from, if you've heard of him. And actually, Jim Wallace came from this group too. If anyone has ever heard of the word dispensationalism, it was invented by the Plymouth Brethren. One of the worst ideas in Christian history. My group contributed. The rapture was one of our unique contributions to the Christian community. Again, you're welcome. I'm happy to offer that. But it was a group that took its identity super seriously. We thought we were pretty much the only Christians who had it right. And as a result, we really took ourselves very seriously. We also took the Bible very seriously. And so that was my original group. Gradually, I tried to find larger groups that had a little more breathing room. And so for me, moving from the Plymouth Brethren to the evangelical movement was a movement toward liberation. Like, to me, evangelicals had a whole lot more freedom than my original background. And then I became part of the charismatic movement and the Jesus movement in the 1970s. Again, it was a portal into some more freedom. And in many ways, as I embraced more and more freedom, some of the people from my earlier groups felt less and less comfortable with me. But a big part of all of our lives, I think, is figuring out how do we love and include the people maybe who don't want to include us anymore because they think we're a little bit dangerous. But those would be some of the groups. I had stints in what some people call Reformed Protestantism, where I was introduced to that. And in each case, I was attracted by something good. And in each case, I think I eventually found the limits of what that little, what I would call a small we or a small us, allowed me to experience and talk about and think about.
Richard, how about you?
Okay, well, as Brian said, there's a lot of parallels. Certainly my beginnings as a German Catholic in the 1940s and 50s in Kansas tells it all. I began with completely traditional values. There wasn't an anger about them, however, and I mean that sincerely. It was just, this is the way it is. Isn't everybody this way? And we only felt sorry for people who weren't. So it was sort of patronizing toward the rest of the world, but not cruel or angry, which is very different than we have now. Then, of course, joining the Franciscans at such a young age, took my first vows at 19 and lived totally in that world for 13 years of education, formation. And that became the movement period from my traditionalism to Vatican II in the early 60s, and a very progressive notion of Catholic Christianity. But the wonderful thing is I was educated into it. It wasn't just feelings, you know? It wasn't just, yeah. And if there was a critique of the old Catholic Church, it was a rational critique. It was usually a critique of inconsistency. Why did we say this if we believe that kind of thing? So that was my second major group. Family, friars. Then the two major worlds I've lived in. This year we celebrate in November the 50th anniversary of the event that started the New Jerusalem community. And that was very charismatic, just as Brian. We were sort of considered black sheep by the charismatic headship, which was up in Michigan. And they would send down letters to us how heretical we were and that I better conform. And and the two big issues, this is already the late 70s, was that I had women in leadership. And
heaven forbid. How radical of you.
And what was the other thing? I can't remember. Must have repressed it. Women in leadership. Darn. This is my short-term memory. But anyway, there were two things that made us unacceptable. So I was invited once to talk at a conference in Calvinist Grand Rapids, where Brie now lives, and Holland, Michigan. Is that the same thing? Or that's a little ways away?
It's only 40 minutes away, but it's close enough to feel very oppressively close.
Were you at any of those conferences, Brian? Could we both have been very young men then? No.
I don't think so.
No. And there was the great birth of the community of communities, 14 communities nationally, who had all developed what we call these living lifestyle communities. Anyway, I'm backtracking, aren't I? Now I'm supposed to be talking about the New Jerusalem, my specific one, and then coming here now into our 33rd year of the Center for Action and Contemplation, where this has been the context, the forum, that constantly made me keep reading, keep studying. I'm speaking internationally all this time. And so I always had to keep studying because I was going to be standing in front of a crowd and I had to know what I was talking about, you know? It was little did I think what a wonderful symbiotic relationship that was. So those were the different belonging systems, communities that have formed me.
As I listen to both of you kind of give us a drive-by of your many hour groups that you've belonged to, it strikes me like what a human tendency this is to just kind of circle the wagons up around an hour. And, in the last episode, I commented that I'm a recovering self-righteous, precious, contemplative asshole. And what I mean by that is the growing recognition that even we here at the CAC and our broader constituency have just as much of that tendency to create an unhealthy, very boundaried, very elitist our story. So my question is this to both of you: how do we find healthy relationality of belonging? How do we find a healthy our while not turning it into another map or arrogant, exclusive our?
Yeah, I'd love to offer something on that, Brie.
Please.
I think one of the great tendencies of the our story is that we then claim to be the story.
That's right.
And we take ourselves seriously, which we need to do. And a family needs to take itself seriously. It's been fun for me this winter. Two of my kids with their kids have been quarantining with us down here in Florida. And I'm watching how my son and my daughter, with their children are building this beautiful family identity, right? That's important. That to be, to be a member of this family means something, and gives all these wonderful ideals. But when we project that out as if that's the story that defines all other stories, we then it has a harmful effect on others, but it has a harmful effect on us. It makes us think that we are normative. And as you said, Richard, it can be very naive and very innocent. We feel sorry for the other people who just don't see what's so obvious to us. So I think that's one of the great dangers, and and that sort of implies a healing for this. If we always remember there's a story bigger than ours that our little group is a part of, and that gives us validity, but that we don't fully understand, we don't fully define, we reach for it, we grasp toward it. I'll tell you a way I've been trying to express this lately is I talk to my fellow progressive Christian friends and my contemplative Christian friends, and I say, we have to embody and create and develop and strengthen a vital Christian wing of a much larger spiritual movement. Our work is important, but there's something even bigger than our group that is really important too.
That's right. It's an art form to know how to keep yourself situated and proud and educated in the group you're a part of without idolizing it or making it the reference point. I'll tell you, what you just explained, Brian, is one of the main reasons I was attracted to this paradigm of the cosmic egg. The confusion, the constant confusion of our story for the story. I've been even strengthened in that in all these months we've had with COVID quarantine. I was given Netflix, and I made the mistake of starting watching some of these series, and one was a history of Europe, which I couldn't stop watching, and more recently a history of England, which I couldn't stop watching. And you just see that's what both groups did, which led to the First World War, the Second World War, just immense illusion and violence. When you really take your country or your continent, in the case of Europe, and you know what, I'm sure all of you know, but it hit me as I looked at it by the time of the First World War, all of the families, the royal families of Europe, were totally, and this is not a metaphorical use, an incestuous single family. They were all related to one another. They just kept intermarrying. And this is so humiliating for the English to admit, that they're all German. Boy, and we are the white privileged elite group that got smaller and smaller. And that's the real point I want to make. Once you play that game, your explanation for reality gets smaller and smaller. Yeah. So the Tsar of Russia and the King of England are first cousins. And in your mind and my mind, we think of Russia and England as two completely different worlds. Not really. Yeah. So, yeah.
I so appreciate that, Richard. And I'm also glad to hear that your Netflix has moved beyond the Borgias, that you started to dip into some.
I was going to ask.
Why did I tell that? Now you've broadcast it.
Oh, yes.
Well, that was my ability to, or my attempt to relativize the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, the Borgias does it in spades. But it's great theater and great costuming, and
yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think what you just shared too. I think about how I remember reading. I think it was John O'Donohue who talked about how every relationship is a foreign country, and so when you visit another relationship, you see their customs and culture, and you have to step into it with that kind of open-mindedness. And I think the same is true for our stories within the different spiritual circles that we've all talked about. And the ways that there's goodness there and things to learn from, but it doesn't mean that the growing edge, I think it always invites more curiosity and adaptation. And I want to just kind of dip back into some of the our story piece from your book, Richard, The Wisdom Pattern. You talk about the anxiety of developing a personal self when you're being pacified, when you're entrenched inside of an our story. Can I ask you to further unpack that? Because I feel like that's a very potent idea. And then after that, how can a person wrestle with the development of personal self within groups of belonging, within the our story? How do we do both?
Boy, that's good. When you first discover that there is such a thing as my story, you first discover your own inner life, your inner world. It is so exciting that you overly rebel against our story. And on the other side, when you grow up, as I did, with an intense our story, you don't need a the story. In fact, it's considered liberal thinking. That word liberal is used in so many ways. But I remember when we had when I was studying theology in the late 60s in Dayton, Ohio, and one of the more progressive Franciscans brought in a whole team to lead the entire student body and the faculty through what did we call it? Sensitivity training. Sensitivity training. Oh my gosh. Where we were bearing our souls and the faculty were bearing their souls to us. And the word got back to the headquarters in Cincinnati, and we were told, stop this. It's going to tear you apart. And for 6 months, it did. To suddenly, where our story was the total agenda, being a Franciscan, and in the middle of that, we all discovered sensitivity training, intense sensitivity training. Some guys never recovered from it, and a good number left because they discovered an I and realized the our wasn't adequate to the I, if I can put it that way. Now, I do think some of them left, unfortunately, because they didn't cook with it long enough to see that, in fact, we used to say in those years, the best guys are leaving. The best guys are leaving. Guys like me, we stayed. But what we meant by that is those guys who really came to intense self-awareness became very rebellious against the Franciscan umbrella. It wasn't big enough to hold them. But that was a short-term response in most cases, not in all. Does that answer at all your question?
Yeah. That was you got to the heart of it, of that tension between the I and the R that was occurring, and that discovery of the I was actually the reason why some of your fellow Franciscans were deciding to leave.
Yes.
Brian, did you have any experience like with that within the evangelical circles you ran in, and the way that's blossomed in different arenas?
My gosh, and Brie, I know you would have stories of this too. There are just so many examples of it. There's a huge conversation happening among post-evangelicals or ex-evangelicals now about purity culture, which created a set of sexual norms that gave so many people shame and self-hatred about their own sexuality, that, people now 20, 30 years, 40 years later find themselves deeply wounded, and they realize that decades of their lives have been deformed by this. And sexuality is one of those dimensions of our life that doesn't easily just go away if the our story tells us it should. But actually, I just came across a quote recently from Thomas Merton, and Paul, I think it perfectly captures what you're describing. Could I just read it real quickly? It's from a little-known work of Merton's, an essay called "Christianity and Totalitarianism" in 1960. Here's just two paragraphs.
Wow.
A mass movement, and when he says mass movement, I think he means a massified movement. The kind of thing that swept people into the Capitol on January 6, 2021. A mass movement readily exploits the discontent and frustration of large segments of the population which, for some reason or other, cannot face the responsibility of being persons and standing on their own feet. But give these persons a movement to join, a cause to defend, and they will go to any extreme, stop at no crime, intoxicated as they are by the slogans that give them a pseudo-religious sense of transcending their own limitations. Oh my gosh, what a devastating.
Wow. Does that say it? 1960.
Wow.
Yeah.
That man was such a seer. Go ahead, Brian.
You can see why, and I think here at Center for Action and Contemplation, the reason we want to keep action together with contemplation is that there's a sense that if contemplation involves, to one degree, facing my own individual story and coming to encounter God in my own story and my own experience, God disguised as my life, that then gives me some leverage point to not just be swept into our stories of racism or nationalism or capitalism or communism or whatever it is. And it gives us this leg to stand on, this something to not just be swept into that massification,
Yeah, and I love that you're bringing up this central tension point of action and contemplation, which for me only works in a dynamic ontology of becoming. Recognition that my story and our story are unfinished. Therefore, if the my story is not represented or seen by the dominant our story, then I have a role to play in animating the recognition that there's more. You brought up purity culture, and I was like, no, Brian, I don't recall purity culture in evangelical movement at all. It was so damaging. It is still so damaging, and to none as much as women. We have borne the brunt long enough of needing to be the vessels of quote unquote imperfection and fallenness in this frame that we've carried out in Christianity. So, as a woman, I can relate to the experience growing up in that evangelical hour where I wasn't represented. In fact, I was scapegoated. And so as we recognize that, this is the harmony of the cosmic egg, right? It's like the opportunity of seeing the cosmic egg as an unfolding symphony that we all have a part in playing. Because when the my story can harmonically influence the our story to become broader and include all my stories. Now that's when the music gets juicy.
And this huge part of the battle, isn't it? The fact, and it's why the word story is so good. My story isn't over. Our story isn't over.
Yeah.
And there's a group of people who are very happy with the current status of our story, and they want to keep it just the way it is because it gives them power and gives them privilege and gives them justifications that they like, and they're comfortable with it. But then we say, no, it's not finished yet. And interestingly, when you stop a story, you kill it.
Yes.
The people who think they're defending it by stopping it are actually killing it.
That's right.
And this invitation, and I love this dynamism then between my story and our story. And of course, then, we always remember that there's a much larger reality.
Right.
It's what I think Dr. Barbara Holmes captures perfectly when she writes a book called Race in the Cosmos. It's a way of saying that our story of race, if it makes itself the ultimate reality, we're in deep trouble. We need to relativize it by a much larger story.
Perfect. If I can go the other direction with our paradigm of the three domes of meaning. By the Vatican Council ended in 1966, and what it had done was, in a significant way, give new wording to the story for Catholics. Oh my gosh, this works. This makes sense. Good scripture, good understanding of tradition, good use of history and philosophy. And so us young ones just became thrilled with it. But 1968, 2 years later, is the single year where more priests and nuns left the priesthood and the convent than any year of history. 1968. They just flooded out of vows, because the old paradigm, which had absolutized itself, didn't make sense anymore if you didn't get the new real story, if the new language. And some ran back to the Latin Mass, which continues to this day. Some run back to the worship of the papacy, and of course they're really falling apart now. The Pope being Pope Francis, he doesn't fit the paradigm. But you can move it from either side, the our story, by a new the story, by a new my story. And I know you know that.
And we have this example, I think, too, of Jesus representing this, furthering this becoming. Like I think of, when John the Baptist, when his followers come to Jesus and say, are you the one? Are you the one that we're waiting for? Because he seemed to go beyond the perceived boundaries of what that group was doing. And it wasn't that he was denying what they had brought and what they were bringing into the world. It's just that Jesus's participation in the story was continuing to enlarge as his ministry and life went on. And I think that seems to be part of how this sense of becoming plays out in the cosmic egg, is that there's no final line to the story that we can see in our own writing of our lives and writing of the groups that we're in. How have you experienced this for yourselves in this? How have can you pinpoint any moments where you recognize, like, you were part of a group that was helpful and healthy for you, but you recognize this sense of, for my story to continue to unfold in this sense of the Spirit's leading, and maybe even to enlarge in our story? Because I think that when I think of some of the folks listening, they are circling in our stories that are not helpful, that they're trying to grow out of. What are ways that y'all could help folks kind of find pathways to step in love and the risk of that potentiality of what can happen when they step further into a story becoming in the my story and our story and the story.
Beautiful.
Well, I'll offer something that comes to mind from the brilliant Parker Palmer. Parker talks about a 4-stage process of a movement being born. And the first stage, well, maybe I should say the 0 stage in which the first stage arises, is a stage that you just described, Paul, where people feel like I'm part of a group that expects me to tell a story that doesn't make sense to me anymore. But if I say that, I'll be kicked out, or I'll be looked down upon, or I'll be fired, or I'll be edged out. So I keep quiet about my misgivings. I just wrote a book called Faith After Doubt, which is about that's part of what doubt is. It's being in a group where you say, I'm supposed to go along with this, but something doesn't sit right. So the first stage, Parker Palmer says, is divided no more. And what he means by that is I'm dividing myself, the face that I show to my group and the face that I keep private to myself. And when something in us says, I'm not going to be divided anymore, that's when the process begins. There's a problem here. I'm not going to play along. Second stage, it involves going public. Somebody goes public and says, excuse me, but I'm not comfortable with this. Excuse me, but I don't think that's the whole story. And as soon as they do, that leads to the third stage. Other people start coming together and saying, I thought I was the only person who didn't see it that way. I thought I was the only one who didn't fit in. And he says they establish communities of congruence where people say, oh, I'm not the only one. And in those communities, critical conversations come. They hassle things out and wrestle things out. And then that leads to 4, what he calls alternative rewards, because he says when those communities of convergence develop, they'll be punished by the existing power structures. So they have to create alternative rewards where people say, we have a right to exist. We're going to take care of each other because the larger group telling the our story is no longer going to take care of us. Anyhow, that to me is a way that, and I've sure seen that play out in my own life.
That is such a helpful frame, Brian. Just even describing the steps. I'm sure so many of our listeners can relate to one or all of them. The moment when you're sitting in the pew or the gray chair, Mars Hill Bible Church, Rob Bell's old church in here in West Michigan, used to call them the gray chairs. And I remember sitting in the gray chair and having this moment where I finally allowed myself to authentically recognize that I wasn't being authentic in being there anymore. That by showing up, I was going against the grain of a deeper longing, and there was a dissonance happening. I was out of tune with my own conscience and where I think the Spirit was wanting to take me. And I bet there's so many who are listening who remember or recall that feeling.
Another name for everything will continue in a moment.
Many of us feel increasing anger at injustice, violence, and indifference in our world today. Join us March 14th for What Do I Do With My Anger? An online gathering featuring Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren. Learn ways of transforming anger into loving action. Inspired by Father Richard's new book, The Tears of Things. Register today at cac.org/anger. That's cac.org/anger.
What does it mean to embody salt and light? In 2025, Richard Rohr's daily meditations turn to Jesus' timeless metaphor for reflecting love into the world. Amid this season of uncertainty, join us in living with trust, being salt and light. For 18 years, the daily meditations have inspired thousands of readers like you. Subscribe today at cac.org/saltlight2025. That's cac.org/SALTLIGHT2025.
It's a moment that, it's more than a moment, but that demands so much courage and good eldering or spiritual direction, or at least one good teacher. And what you have to learn in that period is, and it takes some time, I'm talking about years, not weeks or months, to distinguish between essentials and non-essentials. I think that's what I was doing much of the 60s and 70s. Now, what do I really need to hold on to as essential Christianity, as essential Catholicism, essential Franciscanism? And boy, you only learn to do it right by doing it wrong a number of times, particularly from the pulpit, where you make public your inner thoughts. I'm sure you did that, Brian, where
yes,
and good friends or good teachers would say, Richard, you're right, but you're coming across a little angry, or you're coming across a little egocentric. And I'm sure I still do. But boy, if you don't have an ability to be guided through that period, you will not know how to get out of exile back into what I call reorder in that wisdom book. It's, boy, and few people have it. So what they do is they run back to a reassertion of, because they can keep all their friends, they can repeat the cliches of their early seminary professors and their blessing. The advantage I had was there was a huge flux created by Vatican II.
yes,
Which allowed me to just float. And the momentum was on our side. I don't think evangelicals enjoy that today. You look so much like heretics.
Thanks, Richard.
Whereas in the Catholic world in the last years, there was always a sense, well, these guys might be right. They proved themselves to be in the 60s, at least half right. At least half right. But I don't think you enjoy that spaciousness.
No, it's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable to be in the exile of unknowing.
Yeah,
and
very good.
I want to talk about that a little bit. Let's hang out in the wilderness of the exile for a minute, because it takes a tremendous amount of courage and a trust fall in trusting your own experience to take you into a larger hour. For many of us, and I'm going to direct this question to you, Brian, for many of us who grew up as good evangees, we experienced that exile. And in many of us, as we recognize that there was this dissonance between our lived experience of a more spacious and mysterious God, the desire to be able to hold paradox, and for something that was deeper than the quippy cliche Christianity we were getting on a Sunday morning. We experienced a profoundly devastating exit from, we'll call it Eden, when we suddenly ate from the tree of knowledge and discovered that the categories of belonging were too constricting, and the false binaries, and I don't know, being a woman in general made you not really compatible with evangelicalism. So we wandered in this wilderness feeling like, well, I guess I don't belong to that our story anymore. And that dislocation was profound and, required a lot of grieving, the loss of the connection to that our story. And, wandering around in that desert, I'd love to hear about the process of not, leaving one our story, but not finding a larger one yet, and being in that space of unknowing for those listeners who might be there. And then my second question, follow-up to that, would be, how do we relate back to those who are still in that former our story? Especially family members who maybe have remained inside that tighter circle of belonging, and they're shouting their bad advice, to quote Mary Oliver, at us. How do we relate to them with grace, without needing to explain ourselves all the time?
What great questions, Brie. So it's so interesting when you just asked me that question about the unknowing, just a new insight about my own life and my own story just hit me. And here's what it is. because of my very strict and very passionate background, when I began to feel that the story wasn't working, I don't think I ever for 1 second knew that I was allowed to say, I don't know. There was no CAC telling me that there was something called liminal space and there was something called the path of descent, and that unknowing was a part of the journey that I should expect. Nobody was telling me that. So here's what I did instead. I fixed one more detail. In other words, I couldn't just say, I don't know. I could say, well, I almost know. I just have to make this slight tweak and slight adjustment. And if I could go back and give myself a gift, it would be to say, you're allowed to say, I don't know. You're allowed to, in fact, I love the term you used earlier, a trust fall. I'm allowed to fall back into God's knowing and for me to say, I don't know. I tell a story where this hit me for the first time. On my days off, I was a pastor, and it's hard to go through this kind of rethinking when you're getting paid to keep the old our story alive. And so on my days off, I just felt I had to get away, and I would go hike the C&O Canal near Washington, D.C. Anybody from that area knows what a beautiful place it is. And I'm walking along one day, and I remembered a verse that I'd memorized as a kid, which is, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. And at that moment, for some reason, it just was like a flick in the head. I realized trusting in the Lord is different than trusting in my own understanding of the Lord. And when I could say, God, I'm going to doubt my beliefs about you, and I'm trusting you to help me get through this. I mean, that might seem so obvious to some people, but for me, it was like this little crack in this structure that opened up. Does that address what you're asking, Brie?
Yeah, that resonates so deeply. The capacity to stabilize in the discomfort of not knowing seems to be so central to the contemplative practice, right? It's letting go of my constructs, my thoughts, my feelings, and learning how to almost somatically get accustomed to that trust fall. To follow up, I wonder what is the most gracious way for us to trust fall with love in our relationships to others, maybe those who are still in that more constricted our story.
And this is really, really tough, because then we start asking questions, and then people start being nervous about us, and they start worrying we're going to hell, and they start worried, and words like apostate and heretic and all these, liberal, the worst word of all, start being thrown around. And it really is a socially difficult and emotionally and relationally difficult road to walk. And I can only offer a couple of very specific things that have helped me. One of them is, I call it the courage to differ graciously. And it involves 5 words. I always use these 5 words because they've served me well, and they're honest. Wow, I see that differently. And so, you're home at Thanksgiving, and somebody says, well, all those people are going to hell anyway. And then you say, if you're silent, you feel dirty and you feel complicit. And if you say, Uncle Fred, you're such a arrogant, bigoted fundamentalist, Thanksgiving dinner doesn't go so well. So I found by saying, wow, I say wow because it's my way of saying, I have emotion about this. I care about this. Instead of you are wrong, I see that differently. And I have the courage to differ graciously. Now, usually when you say that, the person says, well, what do you mean? And what I found, if at all possible, I say to them, I'd rather not get into it right now, Uncle Fred. I just want you to know, I used to see it that way. I really see it differently now. If you want to talk about it, let's talk about it some other time, in private. The reason I suggest that is at the moment you can say to somebody, I differ from you, but I don't need to convince you I'm right. You're giving them a phenomenal gift.
Wow.
And the gift is, I love you and we don't have to agree. I have the security to be different. And in a sense, what I'm doing is I'm violating the rules of our story that say we all have to agree on this. And in a way, I might even be stepping into a larger story that allows us to disagree, but still be part of something where we love each other. So that's a little, I mean, it might seem like a gimmick, but it actually has worked and seems to me to be an honest and fair way to do that.
I totally agree. Thank you. That's all I can say. The form I've usually used is, I try to say it in as kind a voice as I can. I'm going to have to think about that. I'm going to have to think about that.
Do you remember Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams?
Yes.
At the conference at the CAC, she had this brilliant way of saying, I might need to complicate that for you.
Oh,
and then
yes.
she would lay out this brilliant, but
complicate.
That's so helpful, both of you. That's such a helpful way to honor the authentic need to speak up in the moment, the need to honor my story by saying, I don't see it that way, but to do so with grace. Wow, that's beautiful.
Oh, well, one other thing I think that is helpful in those situations is to decide, that beautiful old song derived from Ecclesiastes, for everything there's a time and season. And sometimes what people need is not a theological argument. They need reassurance. So for me, growing up in my background, my parents would say, you aren't changing your view on homosexuality, are you? And I'd say, oh, don't worry, Mom. Don't worry, Dad. I love Jesus and I love my neighbor. And that's what really counts. Mm-hmm. So they weren't ready to handle a big argument, right? But I could give them the reassurance that they needed and that they were ready for. Mm-hmm. But there are other times where the argument needs to happen, or at least the story of how I came to see it differently needs to be told. Mm-hmm. But yeah, sometimes folks just need reassurance.
That's so helpful. And I think too about, Richard, I think about the phrase that you're known for of the edge of the inside.
Yes.
And to take this to kind of what we see in the natural world of this metaphor that has been giving me a lot of life is of ecotones, where field and marsh meet, where these two different ecosystems meet, there's the greatest exchange of life. And so I think that is useful in this for me when I think about whether there's differing views, the way that both, all three of you have shared, there's an opening for an exchange of life to happen through those responses. And also, I think that metaphor also works if you are kind of moving, like letting go of one story or ending a chapter of one story and moving to another, there's often this great exchange of life that occurs in your own my story that propels you to expand into the our story. And so I want to transition here just a touch, because one thing that has become clear to me in listening to the my story and the our story of historically marginalized people, it has shown the poverty of the particular our story that I was raised with, and kind of has invited my participation. Because the our story that I was raised with was comforting to the my story. And so I'm wondering, how can the limitations of one's identities, someone particularly who looks like me, a white straight male, can be included and transcended to expand beyond the our story that I've been raised with and that kind of coddles my comfort? How do we expand that?
Yeah. Paul, a quote immediately comes to mind. I won't get this perfectly, but it's by a First Nations leader in Canada named George Erasmus. And he says, where there is no common memory, there can be no community. And what he's saying is, if the white people who came to Canada or the United States tell one story of their history, and the Native peoples who experienced those same years in a very different way, their story is never heard, then there can't be any community. We're living by different stories. And it seems to me that's to use that image of an ecotone, you go to the edge of the inside and you say, I want to hear the story of my neighbor who's been brought up with a different our story.
Yeah.
And now I want to learn and I want to experience empathy and I want to hear the part of this story that I've never heard before. So there's this deep listening and this hospitality to one another's stories that then begins the process of building an our story that's more inclusive. It's not colonizing. It's not saying, shut up with your story and accept ours. It's saying the story we have to tell has to be based on common memory. And let's hear it. I mean, look, all of us who've been married, we deal with that. Our spouses, you said this. No, I didn't. You forgot this. No, I didn't. And we have those arguments because we're trying to come up with a common memory so that we can live together. Yeah.
That's so
Brian,
helpful.
my common memory whenever I've been in an argument with a partner is always my common memory. It's
yeah. You know what we're enjoying, it strikes me, is what we call in a generic way postmodernism. And I do mean enjoying that. My generation was not exposed to that at all. And so it thought it could understand text outside of context. That's what it comes down to. And you could, maybe it's oversimplified, but you could describe postmodernism as discovering the necessity of context.
Yes.
And once that flooded into the world, I mean, the floodgates are still opening. How dare you give me a my story without an our story? And that is like a veil parting from the eyes when you finally get that in a very serious way. And I think it's what makes us get so impatient with people who keep, this is an unkind way, but who keep repeating cliches. And you just want to say, oh, I can't go back to that. I know what you're trying to say because I was there once. I really was there once. And it makes it very hard if you don't have some kind of little bit of kindness or humility, which I often haven't. You don't know how to do it. Yeah, it's constantly a learning. And as you've said, those of you who've been married, you must learn it right there for the marriage to survive.
We've mastered it already. This thing you call listening and humility. But this is reminding me of the broader critical cultural shift that's happening right now around needing to have humility and listening, particularly as white people, right? Because the recognition of white supremacy as being the foundations of our culture, and having existed as the dominant our story means that we have to be, first of all, willing to recognize that we turned the our story, the white supremacy dominant our story, into the story.
That's right.
And I just want to touch on this, the colonial need to dominate and determine and, put boundaries and borders and maps and say, this is the architecture of reality. I have established it. I think there's a necessary, healthy, and I'm glad you brought up postmodernism, Richard. I was hoping you were going to go there because I have so many things I want to talk about with that. But there's a healthy critique of postmodernism, of bringing in the necessary questioning of those maps of meaning and where they hail from, to say, the ways in which we have created hierarchies of paradigms of power over, that's problematic.
That word postmodern has so many debates, and as you know, I've written books about this, and I've been involved in so many of these debates. But I remember being in the backseat of a car on a long drive with an African theologian named Mabi Alakenzo. And he said to me, Brian, you have to remember postmodern is post-colonial.
Yeah.
And then another friend of mine, Alan Roxburgh, said to me once, Brian, you overestimate philosophical history and you underestimate social history. And what he meant by that. And then he said, postmodern is post-Holocaust. And so if you say, what happens to the white people who watched their most advanced, exemplary country, Germany, slide into Nazism and commit the Holocaust? And then you say, something is wrong with our story. And then you watch colonialism, and then the stories of the people who've been colonized begin to come out, and you say, something's wrong with the way we're doing civilization. Those kinds of second thoughts are really the challenge to both our story and the sense that our story was the story. And in some ways, that's where this paradigm of the cosmic egg can be liberating in a really positive way. Because first, by calling these things stories rather than institutions or ideologies, it says they're not finished yet, and they're going to get worse or they're going to get better. And second, by saying there's not just one and there's not just two, but there are many levels of these stories. It helps us, I think, it gives us liberation to say our stories are malleable. Frankly, I think that's what Jesus was doing in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you have heard it said, but, and he said, I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. I'm not coming to destroy the old paradigm and the old stories. I'm coming to fulfill them. They weren't finished yet. There's more work to be done. And I'm extending those stories into the future. That's what I've seen as being sort of the liberation that happens within this narrative framework.
Good.
And it works too on the my story level too, right? We've all had experiences where the story I'm telling myself no longer is working for me, and how we have to find a new story that can be malleable, that can be a large enough container for us to grow into. We just outgrow these stories. I love that Jesus connection too of the law says, but I say. What an amazing model again. Jesus offers so many years ago that here we are still catching up in so many ways as followers of this man 2,000 years later.
He was a cool guy, that one. But one of the things that's coming up in this discussion is, that being in between, the betwixtness of, not, being maybe moving outside of an our story, not quite finding another one, learning how to trust the dissonance of the my story and the our story. It's learning how to honor and make an altar to the middle, to the process, to learning how to lean in with faith, that this is part of the journey of faith as opposed to a problem. Only when we construct maps in stone, so to speak, do we get into trouble with the process of life. Life becomes problematic to a really rigid map. And so much of our spiritual traditions talk about walking in faith, but I really think we're just walking around with our noses in a map, and that's not faith. That's making a destination out of the journey, but you're not in it. You're not in the process of becoming with courage and vulnerability. So if you'll allow me, I want to take a little detour. You brought up postmodernism, and I've recently been digging into some of the meta-modern project, and I'm not going to go super nerdy academic on you all, I promise, or at least I'm going to try. But one of the authors, Alison Gibbons, she described the meta-modern project, which she believes is just another way, a new set of terminology to describe where we're at. She says, that we're dancing in the middle. And I like that she says that. And it, the emphasis is about being in the middle, between irony and sincerity, between skepticism and heartfeltness, solipsism and yet desiring of connection. And she says this in a book called Metamodernism. She says, in a crisis-ridden world, subjects are once more driven by a desire for attachment to others and their surroundings, wherever boundaries are drawn between in-group and out-group, or between inside and outside. She goes on to say that in the midst of this fragile and fragmentary reality, we're trying to find our ground in lived experience and the relationships between our bodies, all bodies, and the environment. And I'm bringing all of this up to say that maybe this can help make sense out of some of what we have seen the last 4 years with us versus them culture becoming the predominant way of how the our story existed. The our story was anytime there's an us and an against them. Because, at least for me, it helped me understand that we've been in a vacuum of sorts, and our anxiety about all this change we're going through, makes us prone to want to cling to a boundaried group of belonging, whether that's political, religious, or otherwise. So I want to ask a question about the ways in which our story can become an us versus them. And I want to ask both of you, what's the role of contempt in animating a small mindset of our story? Brian, earlier you said, we look down on the poor other hours, as an evangelical or as a Baptist missionary, we look down on the Catholics, So what is the role of contempt, and how are all of us complicit in that?
Oh my gosh. It's just bizarre that I read you that quote from Thomas Merton before.
Yeah.
And I happen to have it up on my screen. Can I read you the next paragraph?
Yes.
Because it addresses this. He says, the members of a mass movement, afraid of their own isolation and their own weakness as individuals, cannot face the task of discovering within themselves the spiritual power and integrity which can be called forth only by love. Instead of this, they seek a movement that will protect their weakness with a wall of anonymity and justify their acts by the sanction of the collective glory and power of our little story, our group. All the better if this is done out of hatred, for hatred is always easier and less subtle than love. Hatred does not have to respect reality as love does. It does not have to take account of individual cases. Its solutions are simple and easy. It makes decisions by a simple glance at a face, a colored skin, a uniform. It identifies an enemy. And I think this sense that hate is our great tool to absolutize our story by anybody in the out group now being defined by the way we want to define it within our in group. A quick anecdote. One of my neighbors, it's a long story, but he was a bitter and broken man. And I grew to love him, even though I seldom had to be around someone I disagreed with more. He recently moved away, and he's now actually in his last months of life. But he would, whenever we'd meet at the back fence, he would tell me the latest terrible thing about Muslims, and he just couldn't stand Muslims. And I said to him, have you ever met a Muslim? And he says, no, I'm just telling you what I've heard. And then I'd say, well, let me tell you about my friend. And then I'd tell him about Imam Dawood, or I tell him about Imam Shamshad and other Muslim friends of mine. And I would just tell him the story of a wonderful Muslim that I knew. But it was so interesting to watch his generalizations that he learned from Fox News and from other, of his favorite ways of getting information, allowed him to keep the our story that rendered anyone outside contemptible and hateable. And any counterexample would never even be mentioned.
Mm.
One reason I can't give up on religion for all the criticism I send its way, and I bet I'm speaking at least in part for you, is one of the quickest ways out of this whole world of confusion, complexity, if you can hold the story with grace, with movability, with deeper understanding, wisdom understanding. Nothing else gives you more room to move around inside of our story and my story. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like an umbrella of protection up here. If you have a good thee story, good religion, healthy religion, I don't need to hold on to our story. I don't need to defend my story. The gift of, I'm going to say to Chris, the gospel, the true gospel. It is good news. It liberates the little self, and it liberates the group self from its idolatries. And I bet you in some way, I'm speaking for the three of you too, it's why we still don't want to walk away from healthy theology, healthy spirituality, healthy religion, even though we're perceived by our own groups as being, dangerously heretical, liberal, whatever. It's such a paradox, such an irony for me.
That's
anyway.
such the gift that you've helped elucidate for us, Richard, and the laying out of the universal Christ, because it's the personal experience of that universal bigger story that frees us from or at least allows us to move, as you said so beautifully, with fluidity.
Well, I hope so. Thank you. Yeah.
In one of the recent daily meditations, Richard, you just said, look, that big story is what Jesus called the kingdom of God. And what I have to say for myself is, I grew up Christian, but when I started to get a sense of what Jesus meant by that phrase, kingdom of God, I knew it was bigger than Christianity that I'd been taught.
Yes.
And in the Christianity I'd been taught, I had to look at my neighbor of another religion as someone either to convert or to keep away from so I wouldn't be polluted. In the kingdom of God, my neighbor of another religion was someone I should love as myself. Example after example, the environment was something to not be concerned about because Jesus was coming back and would suck us all up into heaven and then burn up the earth. And in the kingdom of God, every sparrow matters. Every wildflower, however brief its life, has its own beauty, and it all matters. And to use Jim Finley's beautiful phrase, every this has deathless beauty. And oh my gosh, what a liberating space. Yeah. What good news. What good news.
Right on.
Seriously. That's so beautiful. And thank you too for being such guides who stroll along with us in the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, and show us and help us see the delight and awe and wonder in it as we move deeper into our own becoming in the my story and our story and the story together. So thank you for your wisdom and for the guidance, not only this hour, but in all your work. It's truly an honor to be able to have these kind of conversations with you all and know that this wisdom is alive and well and being passed down and being shared across boundaries that are just drawn in ink, and know that we can step over them and celebrate the kingdom of God in its vastness. So deep bow to both of you, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful.
And that's it for today's episode of Another Name for Everything with Richard Rohr. This podcast is produced by the Center for Action and Contemplation, thanks to the generosity of our donors.
The beautiful music you're listening to was brought to you by Will Reagan. If you're enjoying this podcast, consider rating it, writing a review, or sharing it with a friend to help create a bigger and more inclusive community. To learn more about Father Richard and to receive his free daily meditations in your electronic mailbox, visit cac.org.
To learn more about the themes of the Universal Christ, visit universalchrist.org. From the high desert of New Mexico, we wish you peace and every good.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.